Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on this session on carbon accounting, which is hosted by OpenAir in conjunction with South Pole. As we all know, in the CDR world, there's a whole patchwork of approaches and methodologies and MRV methodologies when it comes to carbon accounting. That might be fine in this new and nascent market, but over time, we really need to get to a point where there's a bit more unification and consistency across the ways we approach this. And so today we're hosting Christiaan Gevers Deynoot of South Pole, who's going to present the work of the CCS Initiative. He'll tell you a little bit more about that. But the key things that we're going to learn about today are, why it matters so much for CDR protocols to be a little bit more convergent across the different markets. He's going to talk about how today's disparate landscape of bespoke protocols can lead to standards. And then, of course, what CCS Plus is actually doing to promote a race to the top in terms of high quality carbon accounting. Just to tell you a little bit about our presenter, so Christiaan has over 10 years of experience working on climate issues, and he currently works as a senior manager for carbon removal platforms at South Pole. And in this role, he delivers high-quality consultancy mandates related to engineered carbon dioxide removal methods and conventional carbon capture and storage, with a focus on multi-stakeholder action platforms, such as the CCS Plus initiative. He's had a public affair background in EU energy and climate policy and in industrial decarbonization issues in the Benelux region. So Christiaan, whenever you're ready, feel free to take the floor and go over to your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mega, for introducing me, and to Toby as well, of course, and everybody else involved for facilitating this. Huge fan of the OpenAir webinars, and I look forward to presenting some of the recent developments with the CCS Plus initiative and why it matters and what we're contributing to, in fact. Very good. So yes, the CCS Plus initiative. So this is a bit of a sprawling initiative by now, I must say. And that is not for no reason. In fact, we are trying to build a carbon accounting infrastructure that is fit for the purpose of a carbon management economy that we are transitioning towards. And this carbon management economy involves quite a number of different solutions that we are trying to cater for in our carbon accounting infrastructure. And I'll tell you today a little bit about what the CCS Plus initiative is truly about, how we are organized, what organizations are part of it. Then we'll touch on the wider landscape of carbon accounting and why it is important that these carbon accounting approaches ultimately are part of a standardization process rather than sticking to bespoke approaches. And lastly, we'll turn to the technical scope of work of the CCS Plus initiative itself and how we are contributing to that standardization development. Now, if we'll just dive into the CCS Plus initiative itself, right? And I'd like to start with the mission. Our mission statement is that the CCS Plus initiative is aiming to scale cutting-edge climate technologies such as CCS, CCU, and technical CDR by developing a robust carbon accounting infrastructure. So no specific project value chain approaches, but an entire infrastructure that can cater to a large variety of project value chains with environmental integrity at the heart of it, as well as a dedicated and separate accounting of emission reductions and removals as a mitigation outcome. And these are some key components of the CCS Plus initiative, fundamental principles almost that we are working towards. Now, why are we really doing this? I mean, this is not some initiative that was set up just for the sake of it. No, what we found when it was set up about 1.5 years ago, a bit more, was that there was a huge lack of agreed upon principles and standards for these solutions that we're talking about. And alignment around that we consider to be mission critical in order to be able to scale up these solutions and scale up the market for these solutions. And therefore we need much more robust and transparent carbon accounting protocols, methodologies, as you like. These terms are often used interchangeably to enable independent verification and certification of projects. And that in itself can of course build that trust in the market and these solutions. Now our approach, ensures, as I said, that we are taking this kind of carbon accounting infrastructure approach. So we are not looking at these project value chain elements in isolation. No, we believe that they are highly interdependent, in particular in these three solution categories. And so developing them in isolation is actually rather counterproductive to facilitating that scale up. And so, our approach is quite unique. I don't think anywhere in the world anybody is currently approaching this from the perspective of developing a carbon accounting methodology infrastructure that can cater to these variety of solutions. Generally, what we see is highly specific methodologies or protocols that are very particular to a given project value chain, and so this effectively creates a kind of home for many different project value chains. And we can only do that, of course, through collaboration. So we have about 50 plus members now, allowing us to pool an immense amount of expertise in the technologies, in the carbon markets, and the science behind all of this. And we are creating a public good here. This is also something that has not been done a lot in the voluntary market to date. We will be sharing these methodologies in a way that they can be leveraged by other voluntary market standards and regulators. Now, the actual process for that is still under discussion, but this is the aim, really, to disseminate the work as far and wide as possible, and ultimately contribute to that standardization process that I mentioned before, and I'll come to in a moment again. So, what are our core objectives? And you see here listed on the right side, in sort of three terms, our main objectives. But what we are doing really here is trying to scale these types of solutions by developing these carbon accounting protocols for use in the voluntary market, but also under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, as well as ultimately in compliance markets, in particular the EU and the US. And compliance here, between brackets, in the sense of the US, of course, doesn't have a compliance market as such. In contrast to the EU with the EU emissions trading scheme. We are developing this high integrity methodological framework that can allow for the generation of carbon credits, so that these projects can ultimately attract carbon finance, and this in itself can help them scale, can help them attract additional investments or project finance as well. And ultimately, what we want is to innovate. We want to maximize the impact and accelerate the scale up of these solutions, including CDR projects, by also pushing the boundaries of carbon markets and not relying on past practices, but thinking beyond. And I'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a moment, what that really means in practice. Brief overview of our governance. We believe this is quite adequate to delivering this mission that we set out with. So, steering committee advised by an advisory group involving a number of research institutes, trade associations, and whatnot. A bunch of partners that convene in three different work streams, allowing us to concentrate that expertise, that knowledge, and interests as well, within a given working environment, each of which have their own set of working groups where people effectively work in the trenches with the carbon consultants, and together effectively develop these carbon accounting protocols. Comprehensive membership, as I just mentioned already, we really cover a wide variety of interests, as you can see reflected here. All of this is led by two consultancies, South Pole and Perspectives Climate Group. So we co-lead Secretariat as well as delivering the carbon consultants. A bunch of core partners, quite a number of them, as you can see here, oil and gas companies. I won't shy away from acknowledging that, and that has to do really with the fact that the initial part of the work plan relied a lot on focus on CCS. So now that we are moving into topics such as product mineralization, we see that there's a growing interest from other players such as cement companies. Good amount of different sort of industry partners, as we call them, as well as some leading actors amongst the technology partners in the field of, amongst others, carbon removals. Now, all of this is anchored, in the VCS, so that's the standard from Vera, right? And that's really just to be able to anchor these methodologies in a given rules environment, which doesn't mean that it cannot be anchored, these methodologies, in other rules environments, as I already alluded to before. We are actively trying through this public goods approach to feed the work into other rules environments. So that's just a brief tour de force of what the CCS Plus initiative is about. And now I would like to take you through what we see in the wider landscape of carbon accounting and carbon accounting methodology development, and how the CCS Plus initiative plays into this before we turn to the technical scope. So a key upfront statement here is that the standardization process for these protocols is quite critical for achieving the market scale that we are after, right? So we are talking about a $1 trillion market. That's all great, but if we do not standardize the way that we ensure the quality effectively of these projects that are covered, that we are tracking the CO2 molecule from its source to its destination in a similar way, that we are able to compare projects between each other. If we are unable to do that, there cannot be any kind of true scale up to the scale that we are after, and that science tells us we need to achieve. And so currently what we see is a lot of activity in terms of bespoke carbon accounting approaches, through collaboration with the likes of DNV, of course, within the frontier environment. They have their own quality assurance approaches. And what we also see is that under ICROA, the International Carbon Removal and Offset Alliance, which has occupied most part of the voluntary market to date, is that there's a number of standards such as Vera, Gold Standard, Puro, ACR in the US, that are also developing carbon accounting protocols for the solutions covered under the scope of the CCS Plus initiative. And all of that works ultimately towards the regulators, such as the European Commission, or the US Department of Energy, EPA, in the case of storage in particular, or the Article 6 supervisory body under the UNFCCC. We see that they are also developing their own carbon accounting approaches, which often rely on what they see in the rest of the landscape, what they see in the voluntary market. So this is an iterative approach that ultimately leads to that, to standards, really, and that will probably take a few years to arrive, and relates also to the maturity of many of these solutions. But we'll get to that in this slide. So, as I mentioned, an iterative approach, and so this takes time, and it takes a trust if we want to transition to a carbon management economy. And this can only happen if we have environmental integrity, embedded in this market, in this economy, and that can be done through top-notch carbon accounting. Now, only through a race to the top, not a race to the bottom in terms of the quality of these protocols, can we get to that trust level, right? Can we get ultimately to that scale? And that doesn't mean really that all solutions are immediately, let's say, ready for this standardization process. In fact, there's quite a number of solutions, in particular in the CDR space, that may not have the right kind of, let's say, scientific foundations in place yet to be able to develop these carbon accounting methodologies. And so they will rely on more bespoke approaches, different approaches, really. And until the science is there, we cannot really start developing or standardizing the carbon accounting of such solutions. Now, this plays out against the market development towards ultimately this carbon management economy, this $1 trillion market, where what we have seen now is there's a lot of emphasis on state level support, or in the case of the US, of course, the federal level support kicking in of the voluntary markets. And we're really it's nascent. It's very early days still. There's not a lot of buyers out there, not that many suppliers, mature suppliers out there. And the voluntary market cannot really absorb most of the removals that might be generated, for example, by those big fat bio-CCS plants, such as waste-to-energy plants or whatnot. And so the market needs to grow, demand needs to grow, and that can ultimately only be done if we are moving towards compliance markets. And that is what ultimately this transition to a carbon management economy is about, and moving towards, I believe, a compliance market that has a foundation of high quality carbon accounting standards underneath it. And so there is a term here, a concept that I have not mentioned yet. Effectively, there's actually two concepts here that I have not mentioned yet, which is commodification on the one hand, and the fungibility of different removals in particular on the other hand. So what that means is that if we are talking about moving towards compliance markets, that means that removals that are considered eligible in such a compliance market need to be able to be traded as a kind of commodity, and not as a removal generated by a biochar project or a DEX project or whatnot. So it has to be a set of carbon removal solutions that one may all call durable removals that can be traded on such a market really as a kind of commodity. Otherwise, we will not be able to scale up sufficiently. And so that means a kind of fungibility between removal solutions. So as I said, it wouldn't necessarily have to matter whether the removal is generated by a project of this type or a project of that type. If they all have the same, let's say, quality requirements underpinning them, then that's enough. That's enough for that kind of trust basis that can allow for commodification. And so a robust foundation of standards can unlock this process. And obviously, differentiating between reductions and removals in this context is mission critical, because they are two different mitigation outcomes serving different purposes in our climate change mitigation effort. Only removals can ultimately neutralize unavoidable emissions to get to net zero and take us into net negative thereafter. Now, I've been talking for a bit already, but I would like to take you through, obviously, the scope of our work and how we are contributing at that more technical level. So please, allow me to show you a few slightly more complicated slides with more text here. So what this slide tells you is that we are dealing with a massive work plan, right? So all of the modules here that you see, they are all being developed under the CCS Plus initiative. The ones highlighted in red are currently out for public consultation. The ones highlighted in orange will be going up for public consultation within the next 2 months, if all goes well. And we continue from there on. Now, all of these modules are grouped under, let's say, a bunch of overarching modules. So there's 2 framework methodologies, a set of guidance and principles that we'll be releasing soon, and 2 particular tools that are quite fundamental. One relates to how to differentiate properly between reductions and removals. The other relates to how we can differentiate between emissions that come out of let's say, that are generated in a shared infrastructure in a kind of compliance market, and emissions that are generated in a voluntary market. And these modules subsequently are then the sort of project value chain modules are categorized according to capture modules, one consolidated transport module, and a bunch of storage modules or long-term use modules, which effectively is also durable storage. And we are developing this in a staggered approach. So we have started with the most mature or perhaps easiest solutions, as more straightforward solutions such as DEX, but we'll be moving. We have kicked off that work already into fields such as product mineralization or product storage. So where the CO2 is stored really in materials at a molecular level, and a subsurface storage in igneous rock formations through mineralization. Now, additional modules can be added. over the lifetime of the CCS Plus initiative, but of course only if there's a logical fit. At the start we considered whether to go for enhanced weathering, but as a solution, there's just no real technical fit here. There's no shared infrastructure, hard infrastructure involved here. But all of the solutions covered here, they do rely often on a shared infrastructure, including also the bottom two on the right hand. You see these are two short-term CCU solutions. We have not started developing that work yet, but that's also on the horizon. And as I said, all of them, may rely on a hard infrastructure, and that is why we are also approaching this from a kind of infrastructure, carbon accounting infrastructure approach. So integrated carbon accounting. So we have those two framework methodologies on the left side and on the right side. One for CCS, including DAX and BAX, and the other for CCU. This is only long-term storage, so there's durable storage in products. And then they have a set of shared modules. Either they relate to they relate to capture processes that you see listed here, transport process, and all of that is supported by a range of tools that are needed to operationalize all of this, both tools that exist within the CCS Plus initiative's environment, or the carbon accounting environment that we are developing, as well as those that exist within the rules environment of Verra, the VCS that we are anchoring all of this in. Verra has its own non-permanence risk tool, for example, which deals with the kind of buffers that you might need to put in place in terms of dealing with the risks related to potential leakage of emissions. For a project developer, we believe this is opportune. So we are providing a kind of plug and play environment, if you will. So the project developer has a specific project value chain. So it looks at, are we talking about CCS or are we talking about long-term CCUs, first and foremost? Then, what is the capture process involved in this particular project value chain, transport process and the storage process, and they can alternate depending on the project value chain we are talking about in question. So plug and play framework for project developers, which allows us ultimately, of course, also to sort of crowd in additional capture processes or storage processes if that is if there's a logical fit. And finally, last slide, this is all great if we do this with Verra, but as I have been saying from the get-go, our aim is to disseminate this as far and wide as possible. And so we have a kind of policy work stream alongside the technical work, where we are developing guidance notes or kind of white papers, if you will, that set out how the CCS Plus initiative's carbon accounting approaches could be leveraged in a particular jurisdiction, particular rules environment beyond the VCS. So you see this here. The gray box is where we operate as the CCS Plus initiative, and then we try to feed it into the MRV frameworks that may be developed at the regional, national, or supranational level in terms of policies or regulated markets that are developed, as well as under innovation instruments or schemes that may seek to promote these solutions. So some of them are supposed to be or will be released later this month, one on the EU, the other on Article 6. So what we have done is a kind of analysis of that regulatory landscape, a gap analysis in terms of the carbon accounting requirements, then a comparative analysis with the CCS Plus work, and subsequently a set of recommendations, as I mentioned, as to how the CCS Plus work could be leveraged in that particular context. Now, we have just started looking at the US. Just yesterday, we had a 2-hour workshop with the US DOE to present all of our work, and we hope to feed this work into, for example, the ongoing development of the federal CDR procurement mechanism, and contributes to the kind of carbon accounting approaches that they need to have. So this is where I'll stop. I'll open the floor for questions. So Mega, back to you. Thanks so much for this past 20 odd minutes.
Perfect. Thanks so much. That's been great. So just for everyone watching, we will be doing audience questions towards the end. So I have a few prepared questions we'll start with, and then we will be doing audience Q&A. So if you have those, there is a Q&A box. It's separate from the chat box, so please put them in the right one. If you've already put a question in the chat box, if you could just copy paste it over, that would be great to help me organize all of them and not miss out on any. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a few prepared questions. And I think the first few kind of just relate to this idea of convergence, and that can be on different dimensions, geographically or with the different regimes or different pathways. So what kind of main challenges are you starting to see when you think about, these considerations that can be different across different CDR pathways? So like the carbon accounting, the MRV, all of this kind of stuff is super different with DAX versus rock weathering versus biochar. And then even within each type, there's kind of project by project differences. So what kind of main challenges are you starting to see when you try to think of this big overarching framework that kind of covers everything and makes them fungible versus one another?
Yeah, exactly. That's an excellent question. So what we have done, as I've stressed, is that we have developed a kind of carbon accounting methodology framework that only caters to a set of solutions that logically fits with one another. So we cannot incorporate enhanced weathering, or we cannot incorporate biochar in this framework because they are truly different in nature. But if we are talking about having an eligible set of durable removals or removal solutions being incorporated in, let's say, the EU emissions trading scheme, or let's say the federal US federal CDR procurement mechanism, we need to say that, hey, there's a set of quality requirements that all of them need to meet, and they relate ultimately to, durability of the storage, the monitoring requirements of the storage, the kind of appropriate calculation of what constitutes a reduction, what constitutes a removal, and quality requirements around how we take care of course, also environmental consequences and the leakage of emissions. And so there, I believe, are a set of topics where there has to be crystal clear alignment, even though we don't necessarily know. Or we have to settle for the fact that everything underneath there, that's maybe different for these different solution categories.
Okay, got it. And then when you start to develop this framework, are there certain areas of that, durability or permanence or standards around environmental issues that are starting to become like the more controversial or debated ones, or is everything kind of up in the air still? Like where is that starting to settle out?
Well, I believe that there is increasingly an emphasis on a number of topics, such as permanence or durability of storage. Although it's still a hot debate, can we say 1,000-year plus? That's the only thing that's permanent, or do we say 100-year plus? I mean, there's no clear to the science that tells us one or the other is better, or the approach. But what we are seeing is that there are convergence around saying, hey, we have durable removals, and the storage of that is more stable, and then we have less durable removals, and the storage of that needs to be managed much more, and they are still relevant, but they can't be lumped together. So that, I think, is sort of crystallizing quite a bit. I also believe that if we're talking about the topic of embodied emissions in terms of setting the project boundary, sort of how do we ensure that the construction emissions, or the emissions related to the construction of the facilities, or the the production of the solvents, or the land use change involved with the biomass sourcing or whatnot, that those are taken into account. So kind of, we're really moving towards this kind of cradle to grave approach, I believe, and that I think is great in terms of quality, in terms of ensuring trust, in terms of allowing for that standardization process to happen. Yeah.
And do you kind of see that as like there will be trade-offs, like this approach is, more permanent, but has a little bit more of a land use change impact, and then this one is less permanent, but doesn't have such a land use impact, so we kind of consider them equivalent? Or would there be like a threshold that everyone needs to meet? Like, how do you kind of standardize that across all these different ways of doing it?
Yeah, so I don't think you can standardize all of those things. So there's sort of let's call it issues that are under the hood, right? So if we're talking about biomass sustainability requirements, this has no bearing on the DAX or on on the product mineralization, right? I mean, depending on I guess where the emissions come from, but so there's quite a number of things that are pathway specific. But there have to be certain things that I mentioned at the start that are sort of above the hood, right? Where we say, okay, well, these matters, they apply equally to all these pathways. And because we know that the carbon accounting that has been, that was particular to that pathway is of a high quality, we don't have to look at that anymore, right? And so we can say, okay, all of these pathways fulfill these quality requirements that are sort of equal to all, and that's why we can consider them to be part of the same bucket of eligible solutions, under a given compliance market or not.
Yeah, okay. And then just kind of, I guess, getting back to how we actually evaluate that, both in terms of the LCA, which you kind of mentioned, and the sort of embodied carbon, but also actually how we do the MRV and some of these things, maybe not DAC, but like rock weathering and things like that, where it could be a bit more uncertain. Do you think that these kind of frameworks are going to be, or should be, quite prescriptive about, how do you measure it? What exactly is your end-to-end cradle-to-grave analysis, like things like that? Or is it going to have to remain a bit more project level because there is such variety?
No, I'm afraid that there have to be rules put in place to ensure that people are doing this kind of monitoring and reporting and the verification of the emissions in similar ways. Now, that may differ, of course, per pathway, and should differ per pathway, because you cannot monitor enhanced weathering or and the mitigation outcomes related to that, or biochar or geological storage, product mineralization in the same way. They just have different monitoring requirements, but they have to be set in these kind of mature markets in an equal fashion for all, and that's ultimately the regulator or the rule setter that does this. That's not the the CCS Plus initiative doesn't do that.
Okay, got it. All right, turning to sort of how you engage with these regulators or bodies, can you just talk a little bit about how that process works? So the Article 6 supervisory body, some of the like VCMI or ICBCM on the voluntary side, how do you kind of work with them to a common approach, and what's that process like for you?
Yeah. So, I mean, we are partly a bit in the begging position, right? So what I mean to say with that is that, the likes of the European Commission, the US DOE, they have a lot of confidence in their own abilities to develop these carbon accounting methodologies, for example. And so, we are not under any illusion that what we are developing will be just copied and pasted into these regulatory efforts. But what we are doing is we are building on. So there are two things that we're doing. On the one hand, we are building on best practices that are already out there. So, for example, EPA requirements for Class 6 wells. I mean, we are trying to incorporate this in the rules relating to geological storage. So that's on the one hand, and we do that for with other efforts out there, such as what has been developed under ISO, or what may exist already in the EU in terms of the CCS directive. There, we try to bake that in. So that's on the one hand, and so on the other hand, what we are doing is we are engaging these standard setters or rule setters, if you will. And so, the European Commission, we've had 2-hour workshops with them. We developed this guidance note, as I mentioned. These are kind of bridge building efforts, if you will. And we are now doing the same with the US DOE. And so we hope that will pave the way for, some of the, decisions that we have taken around critical junctures, findings that we challenge that we can't, we manage to overcome, that they can ultimately serve as best practices also for these more regulated environments.
Okay, yeah. And how, I mean, I think I know the answer, but how different are they? Like what the, US is saying versus Europe versus the UN, like where are the biggest kind of differences, and how do you envision that gap eventually, hopefully closing a bit and converging?
I mean, this is a complicated question. I do not know exactly, but what I know is sort of there's two things. One is that the, let's say, carbon accounting and MRV requirements may be dependent on the kind of market or the kind of instrument that you are developing. So, the US is not paving the way for a kind of cap and trade system and the incorporation of removals in that context. And so the requirements that they may have for MRV may be different. If we're talking about innovation instruments or subsidy instruments, again, the MRV requirements may be different. Whereas if we're talking about the EU emissions trading scheme, then the robustness obviously is of critical importance. And so I believe that the kind of instrument or the market instrument we are talking about ultimately conditions the MRV approaches, carbon accounting approaches we are talking about. And so, yes, I would hope for convergence ultimately. And I'm sure that, or I know that the US DOE is speaking to the likes of Noah Deitch or the European Commission, Fabienne Ramos, they want that convergence as well, but this won't happen overnight. And so ultimately, I think this is the kind of standardization process, and we see, okay, what will become the standard for a given pathway, a given solution, and I believe that will then be gradually replicated all over the world, as has happened with many other low carbon tech solutions.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And then you talked a bit about how, obviously certain pathways are not addressable for you right now because they're simply not comparable. But when you kind of think like 20 plus years down the line, we have liquid markets for carbon and people are buying CDR. Do you envision that as a situation where there's, enhanced rock weathering credits and DAX credits and BEX credits, and they're all being sort of comparably traded, or is it still somehow treated differently and sort of priced accordingly? Like what's kind of your vision for pathway convergence down the line, or does that just never happen?
No, I truly believe in commodification as the only route to scale ultimately. And so that means that we need to have a bucket of solutions that we consider eligible for commodification because they're comparable, which relates to the kind of underlying MRV and carbon accounting approaches. I believe that ultimately we will lose out on bespoke approaches. We will lose out on bespoke projects being presented as, hey, please buy our credits because there's this great enhanced rock weathering project in this or that geography, and then you're also supporting local communities, this or that. Now that relates to the voluntary market. You don't see that those same elements you don't see reflected in compliance markets. So it doesn't mean that the voluntary market won't exist anymore. It doesn't mean that all over the world we'll be having compliance markets. Obviously not. And so yes, there will be space for bespoke projects to be sold or the mitigation outcomes to be sold in sort of more specific ways.
Okay.
But I guess that space will shrink over time.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. And just thinking a bit beyond CDR, because I know obviously the initiative is looking at other things. What kind of considerations enter into, CCS or CCU and like kind of trading that off versus CDR that maybe people who are in the CDR world are not thinking about?
So can you repeat that question?
Yeah, just I guess when you're thinking about like unifying the idea of carbon accounting or carbon management a bit, you're sort of looking at a bunch of CDR pathways that are all a bit different. And then on the other hand, you have CCS, CCU, and there's some sort of comparison or like unifying elements in this framework. So what kind of special considerations go into that?
Yeah, of course. So I think, the key consideration here is that of shared infrastructure needs, right? So we are talking about, if we are saying, okay, we want to move towards a carbon management economy, then we are talking about a vast, infrastructure of pipelines of, trucks and trains and ships that are sort of, let's say, pushing these CO2 molecules from one place of the earth to another, ultimately to be stored in a durable fashion, or at least for the scope of solutions covered under the CCS Plus initiative. And so the key consideration here is actually twofold in my mind, is that, when it comes to transport and when it comes to storage, it doesn't really matter whether we are talking about a reduction or a removal. And so the kind of MRV and the carbon accounting approaches should be equal. But if we're talking about the source of the molecule, is it atmospheric, is it biogenic, or is it of a fossil origin? Then the differentiation has to be is critical, has to be properly ensured and safeguarded.
Okay, yeah.
I think those are two key considerations.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess CDR can sort of benefit from the fact that CCS has already been going on and putting some thought into the storage and transport side of it.
Yes, I mean, I believe so. Although, I mean, I won't deny it. It's a bit scary to deal with big, fat incumbent industries that you may consider in some cases, or some might say, they're the original sinners or something, or or what is the, how can we make sure that they don't capture the narrative or this or that? That's all true, and those I guess that those remarks are valid, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage as a CDR community. At least one should not hesitate to engage with these industries, because otherwise they will define the narrative over time. Come COP, we're going to be in a petrol state, right? And they are going to be talking about CCS and tech CDR, the oil and gas industry. And so, if there is not an attempt from the CDR community to sort of crowd them in a safe way, then I think the threat is perhaps even greater.
Yeah, exactly. There's no point pretending they don't exist, right? So they're just finding the right way to.
I think so. I think so. We can put our hand to the sand, but they have much deeper pockets than any of us who is currently operating in the CDR space.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, last question before I do some audience ones. What areas do you think, with this kind of bird's eye view you have around the industry and a little bit beyond the CDR industry, where do you think there's kind of stuff that we're not talking about yet, or there's not enough brainpower going there? And I think, we've talked a bit about, I think a lot of money and time and energy goes into the technology side and to an extent the policy side, but there's sort of other stuff like financing and infrastructure and unifying standards and things, which I think doesn't always get as much attention. Is there anything else in and around this area where you think someone needs to really be tackling that?
I mean, for a long time, particularly in the US, people weren't really talking about storage. Right? You were talking about direct air capture, and then the storage piece was sort of left to be discussed at another time. And so I'm glad that there's a growing focus on this, because there cannot be any CDR obviously without any dedicated storage. So that's a key thing. But yes, no, I mean, I believe the main thing is, okay, how do we get to that standardization process? How can we ensure that commodification, and how do we align amongst ourselves that is really the route to scale? And it's tough, because as a project developer, you want to be able to sell credits from your specific project with your particular metrics and whatnot, right? But in order to be able to rise to the challenge of growing 10 gigaton annual removal by 2050, or something along those lines, of course, this approach won't get us there. And so aligning on what it means to standardize carbon accounting and MRV approaches, I think, is a critical piece of the puzzle towards ultimately, realizing these kind of commodification, commodified markets.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I'm gonna then ask a few of the audience questions. The first one, which I think we touched on a little bit, but this is a bit more specific. So just thinking about how these different regimes get unified, you've talked a bit about Europe and North America, but obviously, as you said, this doesn't cover every country. And then we have sort of the corporate market, and then we have the UNFCCC process with their nationally determined contributions in there. So how does that eventually all converge without either double counting or sort of missing out on bits and pieces? And is that happening, or is that sort of something that, again, no one's really talking about quite yet?
I mean, I believe it's happening. What is happening on the Article 6 supervisory body, has a standardization effect in a way. What the US DOE will be doing for the federal procurement mechanism will have a standardizing effect. The EU's carbon removal certification framework will have a standardizing effect. And so in a way, what we see is that the greater authorities of this world will be increasingly determining what they consider to be the standard for their market. And as their market, in many cases, will be, sizable, they will set the standard over time. And so I guess ultimately, we operating on the voluntary market will be increasingly asked to follow those rules. And so I think, it's not really, what we can do is try and feed into that process through the public consultations, through bilateral engagement, through lobbying, through advocacy efforts. And I believe we should do that. Campaigns such as around the importance of differentiating between reductions and removals, or the importance of changing the governance of the voluntary market, or such campaigns, they are critical to this process. And I believe we should continue doing that. But we should not be under any illusion that we can continue to operate in this playground for a very long time.
Yeah, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I guess relating to that, another person asked also, what happens if it doesn't quite end up converging? And, maybe there's some amount of convergence, but someone says we need 1,000-year permanence and someone says 100 or 10,000 or something. And, all these numbers get thrown around. And if two different sort of overlapping bodies end up setting two different standards, are we just going to default to the higher one, or is there a forced convergence that happens, or is there a chance that this sort of remains a bit chaotic in the long haul?
Well, probably what you'll see is, less and less fragmentation, but it doesn't mean that ultimately there will be one standard for a given pathway for the entire globe, right? So if we're talking about, for example, EV batteries, what you see is standards developed in the EU, in the US, in China. They are not the same, right? And I guess that's okay, because we're talking about massive markets. And so we might end up in a situation where there's a few standards for a given CDR pathway, but they are all considered sufficiently robust and with perhaps different approaches. Now, how Article 6 plays into all of that, I guess, is anyone's guess.
Yeah.
Whether Article 6 will be truly creating a global market for the trade of removals and reductions, I don't know. That's up for grabs, I guess. But what we do know is that there will be a number of major markets. They might have converging standards or differing standards, and maybe that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. And then just in terms of like a bit of that accounting again. So if, let's say there's a company delivering the credit, another company buying the credit, and then a country also wanting to claim, that in their NDC that someone within our borders produced this credit, or someone within our borders bought this credit. Like, what's the right allocation there? Or is there kind of one developing, or is that still, again, quite an open question?
Yeah, I guess, maybe we can differentiate between, two things, which is one is the kind of, let's say, players in a given project value chain, and sort of who can claim the credit, if you will, or the mitigation outcome. And I believe that is really a contractual arrangement. So that just depends on the project developer. So you might have a storage provider, a transport provider, and a capture provider, and some may deliver that as a service. Others believe that they are the project developer at large and should own the credit. And so that is a contractual arrangement, right? But if we are talking about double claiming between the public sector and the private sector, and the accounting towards NDCs on the one hand, and using those credits in the voluntary market on the other hand, then I believe that that's okay. That should be possible. So there cannot be double claiming, between states. So if there's a trade or a deal on Article 6.2, of the Paris Agreement, then that claim has to be allocated to one NDC and not to the one where the removal may have been generated, right? But if we're talking about a private company, then it matters less where the credit is claimed, as long as the removal that is generated in a given jurisdiction is allocated towards that NDC, unless, of course, it is traded under Article 6.2, for example.
Right. Okay. And then this is, I guess, another thing that I've sort of started thinking about recently, but outside of carbon dioxide, there's obviously other greenhouse gases, and there's ways of equating the two in terms of global warming potential or things like that. Is that something that you think can or should be included in this type of framework? And how do you sort of build that in, if so?
This is a massively challenging question. I think that this current framework will not cater to other greenhouse gases, and that relates primarily to the fact that maybe the sources of these other gases are of a different nature. The ability to capture them, for example, is of a different nature, and so I don't think personally that we should just consider, methane emissions of an equal nature, or we have some, equivalence that we can realize between carbon emissions or NOx emissions. They require different carbon accounting approaches and dedicated policies. I would be the first one to say we should increasingly also focus on methane emissions because of the massive gains that can be achieved in the short term. But so I would say differentiated accounting of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of reductions and removals is probably an important way forward.
Okay, great. I might just do one or two more. We had, I think, a few people who maybe are involved in CDR companies asking questions, but I think the short version of the question is, if you're developing a project or, you run a CDR company, how would they engage or get involved at this stage in sort of the process that's going on right now?
Yeah, so what we have been told by some of the bigger players is that we cannot make this into a mini United Nations. Now, I also believe that the UN has not operated that efficiently. So probably that's a correct remark. And so I think what is important to note is that we want new joiners for those solutions that we are currently focusing on and where we can, get extra expertise. This relates primarily to a number of bikers solutions, bio-CCS solutions, product mineralization, subsurface mineralization, although I think we're covering that expertise almost. And short-term CCU, that's going to be a big one. I personally haven't touched it yet, but that's still on the horizon. And so, I would invite anybody with an interest in joining to reach out. Of course, there's a kind of application process which goes to the steering committee, which has to approve it. But we are extremely interested in engaging with anyone out there. But of course, I cannot promise that everybody will find an open door to the initiative. That still remain manageable as well.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. And then just one last one. I think it's really tricky and really important in this industry that we kind of set up these standards that are well thought out and fair and equitable. How do you kind of maintain transparency and trust in the process so that whatever comes out of it, people think this is something to converge around and sort of manage that aspect of it, which I think is really hard in this industry, especially when you are engaging with the oil and gas industry and other players that people have reservations about. Do you have a process for kind of maintaining that trust and transparency?
No, I don't think there is a set process, but I do think there's a couple of key ingredients. Transparency and public scrutiny being one, and so just generally education and awareness raising of the science behind all of this and why it is important that we are going down this path. Why these solutions are critical. I mean, of an existential nature, to be honest, right? I mean, those are two things, and the third thing I think is also to be clear about the value allocation on the one hand and the cost of certain kind of production processes and consumption processes, and how, if we incorporate the cost in those prices, ultimately we can create a kind of environment where we can say, hey, it's okay that we also pay for cleaning up the stuff that we have emitted, which, I mean, I'm afraid I have to say this in a not so diplomatic way. In my mind, ultimately, what we are building is a kind of massive, glorified, what do we call it? A kind of atmospheric waste management and landfilling system, and that's it, and that's okay. But if everybody understands why we are doing that, then there's a willingness to pay for this as well, if we do this all transparently. And those big industries, it's not like they're off the hook or something. It's not like because we are going down this road, there shouldn't be regulation demands reductions in emissions, generally speaking, or the phase out of certain products. I mean, that should still be the case, right? So this is really on top of all of that, and that's why they, such as oil and gas, they play a role. Such as cement companies, they play a role, and we should just be clear about what that role is.
Perfect. Christiaan, thank you so much for being with us. This has been really great. Just before we go, very quickly, a few other things coming up for those interested. We have Holy Grail, I believe, on This is CDR next week, which is next Tuesday, the 11th. And then we also have a new launch of our German program, Das ist CDR, which I believe the next one is on the 18th. They're on Thursdays. Toby will put links in the chat if I'm wrong about that, but I believe it's the 18th with Climeworks. And then also just wanted to let you guys know that there will be an event on the 20th of July, which is from Nori, which is on blended tons. Which you should all check out as well. Toby will put the link to that in the chat too. Everyone, thanks for being with us. Christiaan, thanks again. And I will see you all next time on This is CDR.